do you imagine when you think of the kingdom of heaven? It's not something that we spend too much time thinking about. I mean, there's really more important things that need our attention. There's food to put on the table, and there's trash to take out, and there's laundry to do, and there's bills to pay. Living day to day takes a lot of time and effort, so there's not a lot of energy left to spend time thinking about the kingdom of heaven and what it's like. So we may not stop and think about it until life leads us there, sometimes out of the blue, sometimes innocently, like when your child asks you, what happens after we die? And you have to come up with an answer. Or in more serious times, like when you hear a doctor say, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do. It's then, in these moments, that we start to wonder, or maybe even worry about, what we think the kingdom of heaven is like. So what do you think? What do you think of when you imagine the kingdom of heaven? Do you picture puffy white clouds and streets paved with gold? Do you imagine a lot of angels and harp playing? I must admit that when I was a kid, I didn't really see the appeal of heaven because I didn't really want to sit around all day and play a harp. So, maybe heaven is a little something more than a harp. Maybe you think about a place where you find peace and rest here on earth, like your family cabin on the lake, or your grandmother's front porch. Or maybe you imagine an eternal vacation in a place of indescribable beauty. If you've never taken the time to really think about the kingdom of heaven and you don't have a clear vision, don't worry. It's not about that. It's something that's hard to think about. It's something that's hard to imagine, let alone describe. Though I think we're not doing ourselves any favors when we limit our imagination in two significant ways. First is how we always link heaven with death and the afterlife, as though a death certificate was our ticket and a clear conscience was our passport into this kingdom of heaven. But heaven is so much more than that. Instead of thinking about heaven only as the place where we go after we die, let's consider heaven in a larger way. In a larger scope, the heaven becomes simply the place where God dwells. And in this enlarged territory of heaven, it becomes possible for us to be present with God here as much as in the hereafter. So the first mistake is thinking of heaven only in terms of death rather than life. And the second mistake we make is thinking about the kingdom of heaven, and we only think about that second piece of heaven. We forget that Jesus called it the kingdom of heaven. And as the kingdom of heaven, it's not only where we get to be present with God, but it also opens up a different way of being in this world. Different than what's required by the kingdoms of this world. While the kingdoms of this world and the kingdoms of heaven may occupy the same physical space where we are, they come from very different centers. That's why we hear this theme throughout the scripture. We see this thread of otherworldliness, that we are in the world but not of the world, that our citizenship is in heaven. We may live under the rule of worldly kingdoms, but as gospel people, we're called to live into the kingdom of heaven first and foremost. You might have noticed on the slides of the scriptures, we didn't call it the kingdom of heaven. There was a little letter missing. It was the kingdom of heaven. See, many scholars and theologians have taken to using this term of kingdom to express the radical alternate reality of Christ. while the kingdoms of the world are marked by power and hierarchy, control, exploitation, and violence, the kingdom of heaven is about equality and peace. It's about care for creation and love for all. So if it wasn't difficult enough before, imagining the kingdom of heaven now requires another layer of creativity. Trying to describe the kingdom of heaven is hard because the kingdoms of the world would like us to think that they are all that has ever been and ever will be, that the kingdoms are in complete control, and that resistance is futile. Describing the kingdom in the midst of the kingdom takes as much creativity as it does courage. That's why Jesus spoke in parables, hiding profound truths in plain and simple sight. John Dominic Crossan writes that parables push or pull us into pondering whatever is taken totally for granted in our world. Its cultural customs, social relations, traditional politics, and even religious traditions. Jesus' parables give us a glimpse into the kingdom of heaven, their simple wisdoms into complex truths. Simple stories that subvert expectations and point to a different way of being, a different way of understanding our world. This morning's gospel reading is a series of mini parables that Jesus fires off, one right after the other. The kingdom of heaven is like this, and it's like this, and it's like this, and it's a bit overwhelming. But my favorite part comes at the end, when after shooting off 5 or 6 parables, one right after the other, Jesus takes a breath, and he asks the disciples, "Are you getting all this? Do you understand what I'm telling you?" And the disciples are all, "Oh yeah, Jesus, we're cool. We got this. We know what's going on." And now maybe they really did know what was going on, but part of me thinks that the disciples were just going along to get along. Have you ever done this? I know I have. Nodded and smiled and said you understood something when you had absolutely no clue what was being said. Yeah, we got this. No worries, Jesus. I wonder if they really got it, because I worry if we really get it. Do we really get what it means to live into the kingdom of heaven? Taking a closer look at Jesus' parables is a start, but taking a closer look at ourselves is where the real work begins. We begin by considering the strange images Jesus uses in the first 2 mini parables, though these images might not sound strange to us. He says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed a farmer sowed in a field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is the biggest shrub of all. It becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come to perch in its branches. And again, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast a baker took and mixed it with 3 measures of flour until it was leavened all through. A common theme that we often highlight from these 2 parables is that a little goes a long way. A little seed grows into a large shrub, a little yeast leavens all the dough, a little faith can do big things. It's a nice and a neat message, but it's not the whole picture. It's certainly one way to interpret these parables, but it misses something that would have caught Jesus' audience off guard. See, mustard and yeast don't seem like strange images to us modern folks in America who buy bottles and jars of mustard and eat yeast bread regularly. But mustard and yeast were odd choices to use with a first-century Jewish audience. You see, back then, mustard was considered a weed, an invasive nuisance that would quickly take over a field and was almost impossible to remove. And yeast was a common symbol of corruption and decay. These are strange images to use for the kingdom of heaven. I know a lot of people here have green thumbs. I know many of you have beautiful lawns and flower beds and gardens. Speaking of which, I saw a tub of zucchini that I think took over someone's yard. I don't know where those came from, but they're monsters. So I know you are people that know how to grow things. So I want you to think of a plant that is the bane of your existence. What is the weed that you keep fighting and never seem to fully beat? That's what the kingdom of heaven is like. Strange. And what's unclear in this parable, and what I would really like to know, is whether or not the farmer knew that he was sowing mustard seeds. Is a field full of weeds that's only good for sheltering birds what the farmer really wanted? Or did some of those small seeds sneak in among the seeds the farmer really wanted to plant? We don't know. But what's clear is that the kingdom of heaven defies expectations. Whether knowingly or unknowingly, a field of mustard was not a profitable crop. It was a field of weeds. It wasn't going to make the farmer rich. We get a glimpse that the kingdom of heaven is not driven by the bottom line, and it doesn't stay in neatly planted rows. It grows, messy and wild. It grows into a shelter, a place of safety for those who need it most, a sanctuary for those who need a place to land. And yeast was similarly problematic. Like I said, during Jesus' day, it was often used as an image of corruption. As a product of fermentation, yeast was seen as a symbol of rot and decay. And part of the preparation for Passover was, and still is, to remove all leaven from one's house. But now, here, Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven is like a baker adding yeast to 3 measures of flour, which is a whole lot of flour. Some say enough for 100 or more loaves of bread. So here, in this parable, we get a glimpse that the kingdom is not about pure or impure. It's not about who's out and who's in. It's about a bountiful measure, enough to feed those who are hungry. What once meant death, rot, and decay is now a sign of new life for many. In 2 short parables, Jesus turned common everyday symbols on their head. He denounced the profitable and reclaimed the corruptible. He then goes on to say how the kingdom is like a buried treasure and a merchant's search for fine pearls. It may not produce a profit. It may not make any sense. It may not win you any curbside appeal awards, but the kingdom is more valuable and meaningful to those who never give up the search for it. We don't spend too much time thinking about the kingdom of heaven. We have food to put on the table, trash to take out, laundry to do, bills to pay, gardens to tend, books to read, television to watch. Living day to day takes a lot of time and effort, but the beauty of the kingdom is that it's present in the everyday. It requires us to get dirty, to dig up a field, to plant seeds, to wait and tend and water. But it's there, hidden in the everyday. In his poem, The Great Hunger, Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh gives us another glimpse of what the kingdom is like. Men build their heavens as they build their circles of friends. God is in the bits and pieces of every day. A kiss here, and a laugh again, and sometimes tears. A pearl necklace round the neck of poverty. God is in the bits and pieces of every day, not measuring us against a bottom line, but welcoming us to take shelter, to eat and be filled, to rest and not grow weary. It's been a wearisome week. Another week of people holding their breath, waiting to see what's going to happen next. But the lie of the kingdom is that this is all there is, that this will last forever. But the kingdom speaks a different truth. It subversively sings a song of resistance in the face of tyranny. It actively practices peace in the face of violence. And it always holds out hope in the times of darkest despair. Jesus lived and moved and told his parables in a time when the empire was all-powerful as it was unstable. You see, while the empire maintained order through executing its enemies and supported the hierarchy through oppressive taxation, Jesus gave his followers subversive treasures, stories and miracles that showed them that they were more than what the kingdom said that they were God's beloved children, holy treasures, called to live in a fullness of life that the empire would and could not provide. In the final words of our gospel passage, Jesus says, "Every religious scholar who has become a student of the kingdom of heaven is like the head of a household who can bring from the storeroom both the new and the old." Living into the fullness of life God wants for us requires us to bring from the storeroom both the new and the old, to draw strength from our past, our traditions, our scriptures, but to not be afraid of the new, to tell our old stories in new ways, to new people, to become new people ourselves. It takes us all, young and old, weathered and fresh, and everything in between, to make the kingdom of heaven real in the everydayness of our world. It's not beyond our reach. Signs of the kingdom of heaven are all around us. Subversive treasures hiding in the people and the places that we experience every day. So may God give us eyes to see, the ears to hear, the hearts to believe, and the courage to live as people of the kingdom of heaven. Amen.